All right. I think people are still streaming in, so we'll give it another 30 seconds or so. All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining today, and I also want to thank the IGC and Bread for putting this series together. My name is Isaac Mbiti. I'm a professor at the University of Virginia, also an affiliate at Bread, the IZA, JPAL, and NBR. And today we're going to just go over some material on school quality. So, there we go. Oops, there we go. So just as a quick agenda of what we're going to do, I'm going to broadly go over just some data and just some figures, just to give us sort of a common understanding of the state of schooling, so globally. And then we'll pivot to just laying out some groundwork, some theory, looking at education production functions. Then we'll look at an empirical example, just that's motivated by that, looking at this paper by Lucas and Mbiti, 2014. Then we'll go back to some more theory, look at another empirical example from Popeliches and Archiola, and then come back and sort of wrap it up in some sense, to talk a little bit more about school quality, what we've learned so far. And then we'll pivot to thinking about essentially input policies and sort of whether you can improve quality through inputs, and sort of go through a few examples on resources and class size. And then finally sort of wrap up with a discussion of improving quality through information. So that's a broad agenda. What am I hoping you will take from this? I think one of the things, just first and foremost, is just to give you an understanding of sort of the patterns and trends in learning in developing countries. So just so that we all have a common understanding of what the state of schooling and education is. So I'll spend a little bit of time just discussing what we know and what we've learned. And then the other thing is just to sort of give us, I think, a theoretical foundation of the frameworks that we use to sort of think through these issues. And again, this is going to be through a education production function approach, just thinking through that, how it's set up. Now I won't go into too much detail, but there's some key points that I'm going to just emphasize here, and especially on the predictions and implications of this, and how you take that to in developing your research. And then we'll talk a little bit about sort of empirical approaches that we use and some of the challenges used. And then again, partly it's just to sort of give you a sense of like, what should you be doing when you're doing your research, and what should you be watching out for, and some key takeaways there. So those are our learning objectives. And so now I'm just going to jump into some data, and I'll pause sort of at various junctures to take questions. And so I believe questions should come through Q&A. Julia, is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. If you just want to put a question in the Q&A box, we'll take them.
So please pass your questions to the Q&A, and then we'll sort of pause at various junctures to collect them, and then address them. Okay, great. So one of the things we I think have seen over the last, especially 20 years or so, is just, I think, a pretty great increase in access to education, right? So if you look, and I'm going to use my little annotation tool here, right? So if you look in low-income countries, what you're seeing is basically, as of right now, we're seeing sort of, pretty, again, we're seeing sort of at least primary school education completion rates of sort of are up in the almost 70s or so, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. They're up pretty high in South Asia. Lower secondary school rates are lagging slightly behind, but I think these have been going up over time. And what you also see, though, at the same time, is learning levels are low, right? So this is just a sort of scatter plot correlation, just showing you here you have harmonized test scores. So these are test scores that are sort of essentially measuring the same thing across all these different countries. There's a lot of sort of psychometric behind that. And but essentially the idea is that, these are sort of, they're on the same scale. So you can, measure, these are sort of comparable across countries. And if you just sort of plot sort of what a country's average test score is, so, what do students in that country know relative to GDP per capita, you'll see this sort of upward slope. And what you'll notice is, essentially as countries get richer and richer, their test scores improve. Okay. And so the key takeaway here is that learning levels are lower in poorer countries. And if you sort of combine the data on years of schooling and learning and sort of then combine it into what some people, the World Bank and others, are calling learning adjusted years of schooling, right? So it's basically how many years of schooling and how much have you kind of learned in that. If you combine those two things, you'll again see that sort of a similar pattern, but maybe even slightly steeper slope here, reflecting, I think, lower completion rates and lower access to education, and also lower learning levels, right? So sort of the combined effect of those two things is that, we're getting just a lot less human capital produced in poorer countries, okay, relative to rich countries. Okay, and this is sort of an issue that I think is important, that we sort of, I think, have been focusing on a lot. And again, these sort of broad data set, they're not going to, I think it's a little bit more, I'll show you something that's a little bit more salient in a second. But here's sort of another sort of crack at sort of similar data. And this is by Angris and others. And here what they're showing here is sort of the overtime, and maybe I should have started with this one. But here, this dashed line here at the bottom is sub-Saharan Africa. And what you're noticing here is this, enrollment rates in primary schools. And again, they've been going up over time. And again, a lot of this is driven by free primary education initiatives. So you're seeing that happening, which is great. But then you're seeing sort of learning levels are pretty flat, right? So if you look again here at sub-Saharan Africa, over the last 15 years, it's not a great increase in learning levels. And again, we're not really seeing a convergence in learning across these regions, right? So there's a big gap between sort of advanced economies and sort of less advanced economies here. And that's an issue that we need to sort of think more carefully about. And that's sort of the, and again, if you sort of look even closer, and sort of, again, this is just other ways of looking at the same data in some sense. So this is from the World Bank Development Report. And this is basically just showing you what fraction of students have met a proficiency threshold. Okay, so this is again just another way of looking at the same data. And again, just to flag here, what you're seeing is sort of on average in low-income countries, in sub-Saharan Africa especially, you're seeing that less than 20% of students are proficient in math, even as really small number, less than 10% of proficient in reading, right? And so that's really, really heartbreaking, right? It's hard to see that number and not get upset about it. Right? And the other thing that's also, just unpacking these numbers here, if you look even closer, you'll see that these shortfalls start at a very early age, right? So this is a grade 2. How many what fraction of grade 2 students could not read a single word, right? And you're seeing that, in somewhere like Malawi, it's over 80%, in India, in Ghana, over 60% in Uganda, right? And so, this is, again, just, I think, really, really saddening and heartbreaking to see such shortfalls in learning, right? And you can sort of see similar things also in mathematics. Now, on the backdrop of this is the fact that governments are spending quite a bit of money, right, on education, right? So on average, countries are spending about 5% of their GDP, roughly speaking, maybe a little bit less in low-income countries, on education. And you can see sort of there's a little bit more that's been sort of, if you go from 1999 to 2012 here, you're seeing a little bit more, increased fraction of spending on GDP in low-income countries, right? So it's a big fraction of spending, about 15% of the government budget, right? So huge resources are being allocated to governments, by governments to education. A lot of that is going to be spent on teachers and other sort of salaries. So that's another thing to keep in mind here. Now, why should we be sort of concerned about sort of school quality and learning? Well, if you look at this is just sort of a correlation between education spending and learning, right? So this is, if you look at sort of test scores here on the y-axis and sort of spending here on the x-axis, you're basically seeing, there's not much, it's pretty flat. It's not, it's not a very steep slope there between sort of spending and learning outcomes. And if you look at this in that sort of in terms of changes, this is in terms of levels. If you look at this in terms of changes, the sort of change in learning levels and the change in spending, you're not seeing pretty much, it's pretty much flat, right? So basically the point is that, you can't really just spend your way out of this, right? There's sort of bigger, at least this is what this is suggesting, there are sort of some more fundamental issues you need to think carefully about, and we'll come back to this point. Then the other point here that I think is important, again, just to sort of motivate why we should care about this topic. Well, again, here on the right, if you look at sort of years of schooling, just again, how many years of schooling does an average person have in the country versus sort of GDP growth, you're seeing basically the relationship there is pretty flat again, right? And if you were to look at sort of test scores versus GDP, you actually see that, there's a little bit a stronger relationship there, right? So the point of this, again, this is just, it's cross-country regressions, it's a little bit, so that's that caveat. But again, the point is that learning seems to be more important for growth, right? Because again, that's sort of going to be really the engine of economic development. Okay. So let me pause there. There's a couple of questions, I think mainly about psychometrics and learning levels, right? So so I don't want to get into too much of the details here, but basically, like with these cross-country, you can sort of go look at sort of the methodology, but essentially what they're doing is they are sort of using psychometric models, test scores across different states and times, sort of trying to sort of link common items and then try and sort of develop a common scale so that they can actually say, okay, this is, based on this test scores that I have from India and Kenya, et cetera, this is sort of roughly speaking what an average person in that country learns. So there's a lot of machinery and sort of psychometric assumptions built into that. So that is something to keep in mind. I don't have insights about a particular country like Jordan. I don't, and I'll say that the reading is in whatever the language of instruction is, but sometimes often it's mother tongue, so it varies by context. All right, so let's move on. To just sort of talk a little bit about theory. So when we're thinking about school quality, I think the first thing we want to do is I want to introduce this idea of the education production function. Okay, so the reference here is Todd and Walpin, 2003. Okay, and I'm just going to start very broadly, and then we'll sort of go a little bit deeper. But essentially what we're going to be doing when we sort of set these up is we're going to sort of say, okay, well, achievement which is sort of what, if you think about, what does a school do, right? At the end of the day, it like develops, you learn something, right, from going to school, right? And so, so A here is achievement or learning, okay? And, you can think of that in many different ways. typically, at least in the empirical applications, we're going to be thinking of that in terms of test scores. But again, we all know that's, maybe a little bit of a limited measure, and you can think about sort of, schools also teach you sort of other skills, right? Socio-emotional skills, so you can obviously expand A to sort of include all those things, but typically what we have access to is test scores. And what this is going to do, oops, I realized I made a mistake here because I used F twice, pretend this is not F, but this is a function of schooling inputs, family inputs, and unobservability. Okay, and so the point is that this production function is going to basically essentially give a structure to think about how do learning outcomes, how are they actually produced? Okay, and it basically specifies a production process of that, the technology that actually delivers learning outputs. Okay, so again, apologies for using F and F twice. Just old habit. So just one big assumption here is that all these inputs, the marginal product of these inputs is positive. So again, if I give you more family inputs, you're going to learn more. If I give you higher ability, you're going to learn more, right? So that's essentially a big assumption that we make. You can make other assumptions. We're not going to spend a lot of time on sort of the structure of these things, but again, it's pretty similar to just regular production theory. What I will say is that I think here there's still a lot we're learning about education production functions. It's not like, again, in health, for example, we have the concept of health production function. And again, that's rooted in biology, right? So in health production, we think, oh, okay, we can actually understand, we have some sort of scientific grounding to sort of think about sort of how to structure those. I think the education production function, we're still learning a lot. And there's sort of obviously like a cognitive development science that we can sort of learn from a little bit, but there's also a lot more in terms of thinking about education systems and things like that that sort of make this a little bit complicated. So we're learning a lot more, and I think over the last 10 years or so, I think we've learned quite a bit more about how to think about these. So what are some of these inputs or examples of some of these inputs? So think what goes into these, right, into these production functions. Well, the things that you might think about. So how much money is going to the school? What are your class sizes? Teachers, their quality, textbooks, etc. Right? So those are sort of school level inputs that you might receive, right? That will sort of impact or affect your learning. You might also think about sort of family inputs and the role of that. So, do your parents read to you and help you? Do they give you encouragement? Are there books at home? Things like that, right? So those are going to be family inputs. Are they sending you to sort of extra tutoring and things like that? One thing that, again, it's you can see sort of like as a education policy, you can see a lot of the discussions around resources, class size, teachers, etc. Right? So a lot of education policy actually focuses on inputs. Okay. So measuring these variables, again, apologies for F and F here, it's not trivial. Okay. So again, when we're thinking about measuring sort of achievement, what you've learned, again, we're typically going to use test scores for this. But again, which test scores should we be using, right? Math, reading, right? Should we be looking at other domains of learning? Should we be thinking about non-cognitive skills, creativity? How do you measure creativity, right? So there's, I think, a lot we need to think about, especially if we want to think about a holistic measure of learning or sort of achievement. So this is not trivial. often it's just going to be in a research application, it's going to be constrained by what you are able to measure and what you care about. Typically, again, just from a policy perspective, we often care about what's aligning sort of measures with the syllabus and the curriculum. So we might want to do that. In other cases, we might say, well, let me just sort of take a fundamental approach and look just at sort of a scaled test that is out there. So there's a lot of scaled tests that are out here, like which have been sort of scaled and sort of tested in different settings, and so you might use that, right? So there's a number of different ways you can approach this, but again, this is a key. If you're doing research in education, this is one thing that you really want to spend time thinking about, is like, what should I measure? And it's not easy. And then when you sort of decide what you're going to measure, you have to think about, well, some psychometrics and scaling. Like, okay, how am I going to scale this, right? So, a test is not necessarily something that has a scale that, right? It's not like a defined unit of measure. So you have to think about how do you actually, scale it in a way that makes sense, right? It's not like one test is comparable to another test, right? So it's not like there's a defined, unit of measurement that we can use and it's transferable across all settings and tests, right? And so we want to sort of think about how we scale these tests, and psychometrics is actually quite helpful there. So again, if this is something you're interested in sort of getting into in sort of education research, I would actually encourage you to sort of read a little bit about classical test theory and item response theory, just again as a way to understand how to use the information in tests a little bit more sophisticated, in a more sophisticated manner. Then again, there's always going to be measurement error in all of these things. So you want to be cognizant of that, classical and non-classical measurement error, right? I mean, comes from a variety of different sources. And then you also want to think about, again, again, this is sort of in a research context, but there's a lot of evidence that if you go and sort of give a test to a student, their test taking effort matters, right? So if they're not motivated to take the test, then you're not necessarily going to get a good measure of the actual learning, right? Because they're just like, this is not something that's important, right? Because taking a test is painful, right? So you want to be thoughtful about that. And again, that can sort of introduce all sorts of measurement issues. And then finally, the last thing I'll say is that again, in whatever research you're doing, you should also think about the potential for gaming or manipulation, right? Is there an incentive to cheat or sort of game? And again, that can sort of open up a whole series of issues for your research, right? And so you want to be cognizant of that and sort of put structures in place or design around that. And so these are sort of things that you want to be thinking about, again, just from a measurement perspective. How do you measure this? So we've talked a little bit about measuring, achievement in tests, and again, it's really hard. The other thing that's, also not so easy is, again, measuring these inputs. How do you measure, schooling inputs? How do you measure family inputs, right? Some of these you're going to use surveys and administrative data, but, it's not so easy often, right? So one of the things that's you're seeing more and more of in education research is people using teacher observation data, right? So we go into the class, we send sort of surveyors or sort of observers into the classroom. They record what the teacher is doing in the classroom for over a period of time, right? And then there's a sort of a structured way of sort of processing that data, right? To actually say, okay, this is what the teacher has been doing during this time. Now, of course, the problem with that is, as soon as a teacher knows that they're being observed, they're going to behave differently, right? So these are sort of the Hawthorne effects that are going to make it difficult to actually get a good understanding of what happens, right? Technology can help, I think. I think there's potential for videos and things like that to sort of be used to record and to record lots and lots of data on this, because that's another thing you need is lots and lots of data on this to be able to actually get you a good sense of what is actually going on in the classroom. But this is a big problem, and I think one where I think the science is evolving and sort of the methods are evolving. And again, also measuring things in the family is also very hard, right? Because again, you're trying to elicit what happened through surveys is quite difficult and challenging, and again, so this is where I think there's still a lot that we're learning about how to measure these things. And again, ability is also hard to measure, sort of unobservability, again, and also trying to take that, sort of get a good estimate of that. I think ideally what you would want is sort of to have that measured before the child goes to school, right? Because you want a sort of a measure that's not conflated with schooling, but that's hard to do. So that's just something to keep in mind. One of the things that I think we'll show you a little bit later is often we can sort of get around some of these issues with panel data and sort of making some assumptions about what previous test scores incorporate. So I'll come back to that, but basically the point is that sometimes you can actually get around this by using data on previous test scores, which you can then which you would assume would serve as a sufficient statistic for a lot of these things, right? But I'll come back to that point. Okay, I think we have a bunch of questions. I'll pause. So what do we have here? All right, looking for questions on. Okay, so can social emotional skills be an output? Yes, they can be an output. Sometimes you can think of them. I mean, I think of them as, again, it depends. I think of them mainly as sort of outputs, because again, that is something that you develop over, right? It's something that you develop and sort of you learn, right? So so a child learns how to regulate their emotions, right? So that's something that you would think is sort of a process of sort of education, maybe, hopefully, right? So you go to school, you learn how to sort of regulate your emotions, and your teachers help you with that. So I think of it. I think that you might say there's maybe a part of it that also sort of helps with your learning, right? So again, if you're able to sit down and sort of pay attention, etc., right? So you could, so again, it sort of depends on, I think, the particular research question you're trying to answer. But for the most part, I would think of that as an output. Do social networks play a role in sort of? Can you specify these things in social networks? You can. I think it just, again, it depends on your research question. So I wouldn't. Again, you can sort of model. I think you would just sort of put the education production function sort of just the sort of you wouldn't sort of put all sorts of things in there. You'll just sort of keep it lean in some sense and sort of focus mainly on sort of the schooling aspects of things. And then you can sort of overlay a social network over top of that and say, okay, well, how do social interactions influence parents to sort of channel more resources to kids or something like that. So you can actually build that. So you can sort of think of it as like, parents have some utility function, there's some sort of social interactions that they care about, and then you can sort of use the education production function sort of as a constraint, right? So that might be one way to think about it. The role of incentives, yes, incentives matter. Again, that is, you'll talk a lot more about incentives next week. Can achievement be measured through earnings? Yes, that's one thing we can do. but again, you might think of that as sort of the second stage in some sense, where you say, the primary thing that happens is education, the education production function produces test scores, and then then those of what so there's like sort of like a causal chain, right? Like we improve school learning, and then we improve test scores later. I mean, earnings later. Okay. All right. I think I will move on. Classical measurement error. You can just think, there's a typo on the test, just like I had a typo on my slide. Right? Those are the types of things that would come and sort of bring sort of classical measurement error. There's a question about quality of inputs. Yes, quality would also matter, right? So I'm thinking quality adjusted, not just quantity, but quality adjusted. Do you want to think about these as quality as well? Then I think last one here, are standardized tests a good measure of achievement? Maybe, again, I think it's sort of going to, you want to be very careful about how you use these things. So I think the point is that, if it's well developed, you can sort of avoid those biases, right? So again, if you go in and sort of test, pre-test, pilot, make sure that the language that you use is accessible and doesn't sort of include biases. And yes, you can actually develop tests that are pretty good, but you have to test them. You have to test them widely and make sure they're validated. Okay, so let's move on. So here's just some input data. This is some data that's readily available. So I took data from the World Bank service delivery indicators from selected African countries. And again, this is just to give you a flavor of what's going on. Now, this is, again, I think as someone pointed out, this is mainly looking at quantity of inputs, not looking at quality of inputs. So keep that in mind. But again, we'll try. I'll show you a little bit of data on quality in a second, at least on one input. So textbooks. So I think there's a lot of emphasis on sort of ensuring kids have textbooks in many different countries. So if you look in Togo, Kenya, and Nigeria, you'll see there's about 2 to 3 students sharing one textbook, right? So that's sort of the textbook to student ratio, right? So there's not that it's not 1-to-1. Okay, it's pretty bad in Uganda, at least according to this data. We have 14 students per textbook, right? So it's actually pretty bad, right? So there's quite a bit of variance there. The data also asks about sort of school infrastructure. So does the school have electricity, water, and sanitation? And again, here you see just, I think, a lot of variance across these different settings. 17% of schools have minimum infrastructure in Nigeria, up to 56% in Uganda and Kenya. Do the schools have minimum teaching equipment? So, on the one hand, you have Kenya and Uganda with 95%, and then on the sort of other end of the scale, you have, Togo with 28% of schools, right? So quite a variety of settings and contexts where you're seeing sort of, I think, different constraints that are showing up. Okay. So here's maybe one thing you can think, I think, just to come back to the question of quality, right? So are there, what does the pupil teacher ratio look like, right? How big are these classes, right? Do they have enough teachers, so to speak, right? So Madagascar and Nigeria, you have about, 20, students per class, roughly speaking. You have about 30 students per class in Senegal and Kenya, and about 45 in Uganda and Tanzania, right? So, again, maybe it's a little bit high here, but I think over here, they're not bad, right? They're not bad. Now, that's one measure, which you might say, okay, this is just a measure of sort of teaching quantity, right? Teacher quantity, right? But then we can say, okay, well, what's the quality of that input? Well, if you look at measures of absence, you'll see that maybe there's a little bit of a quality issue here, so to speak, right? And again, I'm using this in quotes. in Kenya, 15% of teachers were absent on a given day. It's up to about 24% in Uganda, right? And then when you look at, are you absent from the classroom? Okay, so again, this is absent from the school, this is absent from the classroom, right? So the teachers are in the school, this is right, but often they're going to be not in the classroom. They're going to be out, drinking tea, interacting with colleagues, doing other things, right? So you'll see a lot of, and I've witnessed this myself. You go to a school, there's a classroom full of kids and there's no teacher, right? That's not an uncommon sight to sort of observe. So 22% of teachers were absent from the classroom in Nigeria. 50% in Uganda and Morocco were absent. Okay, so then you start asking, well, there's quantity, but is there quality of input, right? And again, just to sort of follow up on that, we can see sort of like, what do these teachers know? Okay, and do they have the content knowledge that they need? And, depending on how you measure it, you can see that, on average across all, this is a sample of, I think, 7 or 8 countries, only about 7% on average of teachers had the minimum knowledge required. Again, this is it depends sort of how they define this, right? So you can, if they use a sort of a looser metric, it's 66%. If they use a sort of more strict version, it's 7%. It seems to be much harder for language. Okay, in math, it's a little bit less of an issue, but still, in Togo, it's only 50% of teachers had the understanding of the material, right? And so again, quality also matters. Okay, and that's, I think, something that we will come back to. Okay, so with a lot of this is we can sort of think about, again, if we look at the education production function, we might be tempted to think, oh, all I have to do as a policymaker, right? If I just look at this and sort of just take a very naive approach, I might say, well, if I just increase learning level, increase inputs, right? I'm going to solve my problems, right? This approach, I think, has a bunch of problems and challenges. So one is, let's say, you want to identify sort of the binding constraint, right? So which one is sort of the key constraint that's binding you and holding you back from sort of achieving better learning outcomes? So, that might be challenging to sort of figure out exactly which one is binding. More so, it might be a case where you have more than one input binding, where you have multiple constraints, okay? And the implication is that, if you just alleviate one, right, the other one might still be binding, and so then you don't really see much of an effect, right? So that's something to sort of keep in mind, is that, often, and this is why you see, I think, a lot of reforms are often sort of packages, right? So they do multiple things at the same time, right? Because the idea is that, this is not just a problem that has just one constraint, it's a multifaceted problem, and we need to sort of component solutions to solve this, right? And so that's why you see a lot of sort of reforms that sort of target many different things at the same time. Some of these things are really hard to alleviate, right? So again, I just showed you some data that 50% of teachers in Togo didn't have the requisite math skills, right? How do you alleviate that, right? That's something that is very difficult, right? I mean, it's not like you can sort of, overnight or even in a few months, sort of get them to sort of learn math, right? While still sort of teaching at the same time, right? So it's a very difficult thing to solve, right? So some are going to be easier than others, like, providing textbooks, relatively easy. Addressing teacher content knowledge, pretty difficult, right? So that's something also that I think is very challenging. So basically, the point is that it's important to understand the structure of the education production function. And one thing we can do there is sort of to use data to actually estimate sort of what does this thing look like, what is the structure of it, what are the parameters of it. But it's really hard to do that from observational data, right? Again, and one of the challenges is that this unobservability is going to be likely correlated with school inputs, right? So basically, you might think that more able students are going to basically attend better input schools, right? They're going to be attracted to those schools, right? And so that's going to really give us a lot of omitted variable bias and sort of a lot of challenges to actually addressing this. So we're going to look at one study here, just to sort of look at an empirical example. Now, before I do that, let me jump in. Izzy, can you help me with the Q&A?
Sure, we have a few questions. The first is about the World Bank data that you were on previously, asking if it included both private and public schools. Another question on that data is how the teacher's attendance was collected. And possibly another question about input from previously in the lecture. Is nutrition a necessary input in the education function?
Okay. So yes, the World Bank SDI data is national representative. It includes urban, rural, private, public. Again, in most of these contexts, I should mention that private school enrollments are not that big, so the bulk of those schools in the sample are going to be public schools. Is nutrition in the education production function? Yes. Yes, you clearly, and I think especially when not just sort of like, how much, are you sort of stunted, et cetera, but also just like, do you have your micronutrients? So I think we're even learning more a little bit about, brain development and sort of the importance of things like iron for, cognitive development, right? So you can think that's a key thing, So yeah, health, nutrition are going to be part of that. And again, you can think of that as just part of the family, because that's basically the family is going to be providing those types of inputs at home. And then, how do you measure attendance? Typically what happens is the best way to measure it is you basically show up at the school with sort of a team of surveyors and enumerators, and then you basically, go down and sort of do a roll call and see which teachers are there, which teachers are not there. Again, if you do this unannounced, it's much better. And then you basically go around to the school and then see, are the teachers in the classroom when they're supposed to be there. That's how you do it. Okay, great. So so let's quickly go through this paper on school quality and student achievement using a discontinuity in Kenya. So the context here is Kenyan secondary schools in the mid-2000s. And essentially, the way you want to think about this, what's going on in this setting is to transition from primary school to secondary school, you have to take an exit examination known as the KCP, Kenya Certificate for Primary Education, or at least you used to. And then secondary schools, there are going to be 3 tiers of secondary schools. There's going to be these elite secondary schools that are very prominent, have these wonderful reputations. That's where all like the famous people in the country went, ex-presidents, etc. And then and they recruit students from across the country. Then you have sort of second tier schools, which are sort of good schools. They're called provincial schools, which are going to recruit from a sort of more regional basis. And sort of the best remaining students from the region. And then you can think of sort of the third tier of schools, which are going to be local schools, essentially just recruiting from the local neighborhood. Okay, and essentially what you have to do is, as you're sort of filling out your registration for this exam. So again, this is prior to taking the exam. You don't know what you scored. You basically fill out a list with your preferences, saying this is the schools I want to go to. Okay, and then essentially, and you sort of say, okay, I want to go to these elite schools. These are the good schools I want to, my regional schools I want to go to, and these are my local schools I want to go to. And then you so you fill out that preference sheet out, and then after the exams are graded, they'll do this sort of assignment process where it's basically what's called a serial dictator algorithm. You start with the best student, this best student gets their choice, their first choice. Then you go to the second student, they get their first choice. If it's not full, if that first choice is full, again, because schools have, they can only take so many students, right? If that choice is full, you move to the next choice, right? And then they get that one, and so on and so on and so on. You just basically move down the list of students by rank until until you've gone through all the students. Okay, that's basically the setup. Okay. So, right. So I just sort of talked about this. So national schools, either the fancy schools, provincial schools, or the regional, sort of they're good schools, and then the district schools are going to be the sort of you can think of these as the safety schools, right? You're just going to your local school. They are private schools, but again, these are not that important. Just to give you, I think, just a visual of what these schools look like. So this is a district school. You can see that it's not painted. There's no electricity here, right? It's pretty crowded, but it looks like the students are working pretty hard. Okay. This is a provincial school. Again, you can see that it's got a lawn. It's pretty big, nice buildings, multi-tiered block, right? This is just a single block, right? This. So you can see that there's multiple levels, just a lot fancier in some sense, right? And then this is sort of like a national school, right? So again, much fancier, got a big old, auditorium, all these libraries, fancy equipment, right? Computer labs, one of them, some of them even have planes to teach aviation, right? So just like huge differences in sort of resources and facilities across these schools, right? And again, this is just to give you a sense of what's going on. Again, teachers in the sort of elite national schools, more likely to have a little bit more likely to have a college degree, a little bit more likely to have an advanced degree. They're more experienced, and then these schools are also offering a lot more subjects, right? So basically, it's an indication of that they have a broader curriculum as well, right? They offer a broader curriculum. Okay, so that's essentially the context. What we're going to do here is basically use a regression discontinuity design to basically say, okay, let's examine two students, one who, because again, basically based on the way this is set up, you're going to have students who just miss getting into a good school and then are going to go to a less good school, right? So we're going to actually have lots of these RDDs, and we can sort of essentially pool all of them together and run one big massive regression. But the basic idea is that you'll have students, again, you have your test score, you have your preferences, right? You have students who are just going to miss going to one of these schools and students who are just going to get in, okay? But the point is that they're going to be very similar, right? Because you're looking at 1 point difference on an exam, so to speak, right? One just made it above the threshold, one just missed by 1 point, right? But the assumption is that those students are identical, and they would sort of do equally well if they had sort of gone to the same school. Okay. So this is again the RDD, and you can run this sort of as as an IV in a sort of two-stage setup, right? And so in the first stage, you're going to be looking at whether or not you went to a fancy school as a function of whether you're above the cutoff, whether your test score is above the cutoff. And we're going to sort of, include controls for your preferences and other things. And then also whether or not just a sort of a smooth polynomial, in this case, just a linear line in terms of just the running variable, the KCP score, or I guess distance to the cutoff, I should say, to be precise. Okay, so that's basically the setup. And then the second stage, we're going to look at sort of your final test score outcomes at the end of secondary school as a function of which school you went to, whether you went to this fancy school, and then which again is instrumented with this first stage. Okay, so the nice thing about RD is I can do all of this in graphs. Okay, so again, here's the cutoff, right? So how far are you from the cutoff? So we're going to basically, again, we have multiple different schools, etc. we're just going to put everything at 0, right? So we're basically going to recenter everything to 0, right? So we're going to just recode everything and sort of say, okay, how far are you from the cutoff? Okay, and that way it allows us to basically bring everything sort of on a consistent scale. And so if you're far from the cutoff, this is a probability of sort of going to a national school, a fancy school. You'll see that, again, this is a fuzzy RD, right? Because it's not, it's not perfect. There's not perfect compliance. There's imperfect compliance. So if I'm on this side of the RD, much less likely to go to a private school. If I'm on this side of the RD, the side of the cutoff, sorry, I'm much more likely to go to the fancy school. And you can sort of see that there's a huge jump here right at this cutoff. Okay, and that's basically what we're going to exploit, is the increase in this probability when you sort of go from just to the left to just to the right of this. Okay, and well, what happens is I'm exposed to again. So this is same picture essentially, same setup, but now I'm looking at the average quality of my peers. Okay, and there's a huge jump in the quality of your peers, right? So this is, you can think of this as sort of just the test scores at the school level, right? Again, if I'm on the left of this, I am going to have peers who are, they're okay, they're not, right? But if I'm on the right of this, I'm going to have peers that are really, really smart, right? And so this is a 0.6 SD increase in test scores, right? So it's really big. Right? You're going to be exposed to much smarter kids. One thing you worry about is obviously, are there compositional effects, etc. Also, just sample selection effects, so to speak. Attrition, differential attrition, different. Right? So basically, if I go to the fancier school, am I more likely to take the secondary, basically graduate from secondary school? And you're basically seeing none of that, right? So it's pretty flat here. There's no selection of test taking at the end, right? So that's good, because that means that we can interpret test scores. It's easier to interpret. We don't have any sort of selection that we have to worry about. Okay. So again, just to recap, if you're on the right of this, you're much more likely to go to a fancy school with better students, better peers, better teachers, better facilities, an airplane. If you're on the right of this, you're going to a not a worse school, so to speak. Okay. And what do we see in terms of learning? It's pretty much a straight line. Okay. So in this context, what we're seeing is that again, going to a better school in the way we've, again, at least by reputation, etc., and facilities and all this stuff, does not lead to better outcomes. Okay, so that's the, and again, this is a pretty precise effect. Again, here's the results in terms of this is what you want to look at here in terms of regression, right? So the point estimate is 0.01, right? 0.015, right? Standard errors are 0.05, right? So we can basically rule out effects, 0.12 or so, right? So 12% of a standard deviation, right? So again, we can rule out things bigger than that, right? So we're not really seeing anything big or moderate, right? So again, this is, I think, pretty, maybe I'm a little biased, but I think it's pretty convincing evidence. There's no learning effect from going to one of these fancy schools in this context. Okay, so why? Okay, why are we seeing this? Well, it could be that inputs don't matter. Okay, that's possible. Okay, there might be some other sort of constraint that's binding. It could also be that, again, hey, maybe these schools aren't good at all, right? It's basically that their reputations are basically based on who they attract, right? So they basically just bring in better students, but they don't really teach better, right? And so that's basically what we're seeing here, right? Maybe we're measuring the wrong outcome. Maybe they don't really change sort of these test scores, but they sort of change other things about students and we're not measuring that. Maybe if we looked at earnings, we might see something different. that's possible. Just again, this is maybe, we tried to do this, but unfortunately we weren't able to do that. But we were really, really excited about looking at that. But that wasn't possible. Then the other thing is just to say, well, maybe we should look a little bit closer about what we're learning. Okay, and I'll come back to this point in just a second. So, basically the point here is that this RD that I've just estimated, maybe it's telling, I might think that it's basically telling us what is the effect of improving school inputs. Okay, so you can just think, if you just think about one input's peer quality, for example, right? Maybe this RD is saying, if I'm exposed to better peers, right, I'm not going to have a sort of increase my learning outcomes. Okay, so that's okay. So that's one interpretation. One thing that I want to sort of emphasize is that if we were to take a little bit of a step back and look at sort of the theory a little bit, we might actually uncover, I think, another possibility, which is that there might be other behavioral responses at play. And that's sort of a key thing that I want to sort of emphasize here. Okay, so let's sort of unpack that a little bit. Again, go into a little bit more theory. Okay, let me pause for 1 minute to see if there's questions.
Yeah, we have a few questions. I'll take a selection. Is there heterogeneity among the elite schools? In some countries, the low quality schools can be very similar, but the top schools are very heterogeneous. Is it worthy to pay attention to this? Another question is simply, why was it impossible to look at earnings in this study? And
I'll take that one.
Yeah,
we didn't have to. That's basically it. And we weren't able to raise funding to sort of do something perspective on it. So, if someone's listening to this and wants to know, wants to fund my study, I'm really happy to do it. So, but yeah, we basically couldn't do it. Yes, go on.
I'll take one more question because these are fairly long. Maybe I missed it, but did you do this with district schools or provincial schools as well? Can this be a result of focusing on already relatively better performing students?
Okay, so yeah, that's good. So yeah, so basically what we're looking at is the people who are at risk, so to speak, or on the margin of going into a elite national school, are those on the margin of basically national school, provincial school. So you're really looking at that margin, right? And so you might argue that, hey, actually, part of the issue is that the fallback school it's not that bad, right? So the difference in quality between the elite school and a really good provincial school is not that great, right? So we tried to do a little bit of that to sort of assuage those concerns. For example, some of the best provincial schools are going to be in the capital, in Nairobi. So if you throw out Nairobi, you're basically throwing out some of the best provincial schools, and you basically see the same effect, right? So it's we don't think it's really coming. It could be again, but we sort of did that robustness check. Okay, let me move on. So let's go back to the theory. And here's I think this is sort of a key thing that I want to sort of transmit, okay, in this lecture. Okay, so we're going to go back to Todd and Walpin. This is also the model that Pop Elliches and Urquiola use in their study. Okay, so it's basically building on him. I actually have the correct notation now. I have G for my production function rather than F before. F is family inputs. Okay, so we're going to have 3 periods. So T is equal to 0. That's basically before the child starts schooling. T is equal to 1 and T is equal to 2. Basically, the start of the first 2 years of schooling, right? So basically, at this time 0, the parent is, think of that as preschool. The parent is feeding the child, reading the child, etc. Okay. And so they're getting inputs. And so that's A1 is basically what the child is going to start out with at the beginning of the year. Think of this as grade 1. At the beginning of grade 1, this is sort of what the child knows. And then at the beginning of grade 2, right, which is A2, that's what they know. and it's a function of all the inputs they received from their parents, back in the day, the inputs they received from the parents now into sort of the first year of schooling, and sort of all the inputs they received in the first year of schooling, right? And that's basically what they end up learning. You can think of this as the end of the first year or the beginning of the second year, right? Basically the same thing. Okay, so that's the setup. So it's essentially we're just indexing our production function with time and just sort of being a little bit more specific about the timing of some of these things, and distinguishing sort of current and previous, so current in flows and previous flows, right? So, but again, what this points out also, I think, just to point out, is that cumulative inputs matter. Okay, so again, if we were to look further down A3, A4, you would end up having S1, S2, etc. Right? So with these production functions, what it's also telling you is it's not just current inputs that matter, but also previous inputs that matter, and that makes measurement even harder, right? Because again, you're going to basically have a lot of cases where you're not going to have a way of measuring some of these cumulative inputs, right? It's going to be very tricky. So other notation, we'll have W as family wealth, which will come back in a second. Okay, so parents are going to expect to receive the child to receive S1 bar units of inputs. Okay, and that is going to be driven by sort of their wealth, the child's ability, and sort of the achievement of the kid, basically a starting level of the kid. But schools are the ones that are going to decide the actual amount of input, right? So you can think of this as like, the child comes to school, the parent says, oh, I'm bringing you to this school because I think it's a good school. The child comes to the school sort of says, oh, okay, here's little Izzy, just because that's Izzy's helping us out. Here's little Izzy, which class we're going to put her in, which teacher we're going to put her in, right? And they're going to basically make an assessment of like, okay, she needs to be in this class because this teacher is really good is going to be really good with Izzy, and that's going to be a good setting for her, right? So the school is one who actually decides what happens. Okay, so the difference between those two things is going to be S1 minus S1 bar, right? So there's going to be some gap between what the parents want and what the child actually receives. Okay, then households observe that gap and then decide how much to invest in input. Okay? They can react to that. Okay, now here's the thing. Okay, from that structure, okay, we can sort of think about what is the exogenous effect of an exogenous change in one input. Okay, so we're just going to think of S1, holding everything else constant. Okay, and essentially you can sort of that sort of boils down to this term, which is basically the derivative of the marginal product of from the production function with respect to the school input. Okay, so basically, what's the marginal productivity of school input from the production function, right? That's that parameter. Okay, so again, if I change one input, hold everything else constant, that's what I'm going to get. Okay, and again, this is just purely a production function parameter. Okay, now the point, so again, we might think what I just estimated in my previous study was this parameter. Okay, but you actually don't get this parameter. Okay, what you get is, and why is that? Basically, if I change an input, right? If I give your child more or less in the school, you as a parent are going to respond, right? So if you notice, oh, I don't like this teacher, you're basically going to say, oh, okay, well, let me read more at home with my child. Let me send them to tutoring on the weekends, right? So you're going to do more, right? You're likely to respond. Okay, and not just you as a parent, but also teachers, students, others can respond, right? So there's just a lot of scope for responding to a change in an input. Okay, and so the key insight here is that when you what you typically answer, actually, from an experiment, when you change one input, is you actually get a total effect. So the total derivative of the production function with respect to S1. Okay, that breaks down to the production function parameter, this marginal product of school input, plus these sort of indirect effects, right? These sort of responses. Okay. Okay. So basically, there's going to be a parents are going to see sort of this change in input relative to their expectations. They're going to change their behavior as a result, and then that's going to, as a result of them changing that behavior, it's going to also affect learning through the production function, right? So it's going to be this additional indirect effect here. And so this term here, again, is what we call a behavioral effect, okay? So what an experiment or, any sort of quasi-experimental study is actually, right? Because again, you can't prevent this as a research, right? You can manipulate sort of what, one input, but you can't hold everything else constant, right? And so this is something you have to sort of think carefully about. How are parents, et cetera, going to respond? Who's going to respond, and how are they going to respond to the change in input? Okay, you're not going to capture this. So what you get is this whole term, which is, again, the production function parameter and the behavioral parameter. Okay, you can extend this idea to account for multiple inputs. Okay, basically goes same sort of logic goes through, but the point is that you will not, an experiment is not able to actually pin down this pure education production parameter. Okay. So then the question is, well, if we don't actually uncover the production function parameter from an experiment, is it still useful? Yes, right? Because you're actually getting, a policy effect, like what's actually going to happen in reality, right? Like the total effect is really important. If if you were a government, you sort of change something at the school level, right? Parents are going to respond, right? You want to understand that, right? That the policy effect is actually very, very important, right? Maybe even more important, but that's what's going to happen in reality, right? So that's actually very important to understand and to actually have a good estimate of that. So that's going to deliver treatment of the treated, right? TOT, average total effect for those in the experiment. If you were doing a quasi-experiment like an IV, you're going to be estimating a local average treatment effect, again, because it's driven by compliance. Okay. And then the other thing I'll say real quick is that this structure makes clear the assumptions we need to justify external validity. Okay. So again, what do I, if I run an experiment or some study in one setting, can I extrapolate that to another setting? Well, maybe. You need to assume that the production function is sort of similar across settings, right? And then you also need to assume that there's going to be a similar behavioral effect, right, across settings. That parents are going to respond like this, teachers are going to respond like this, students are going to respond like this on average, right? So those are two big assumptions, right? And so that's something to keep in mind as you design things. Okay, so let me pause here before I jump into the next study.
We have a couple of questions. Yeah. The first is, how soon after moving to the new school are these test scores measured? And the other is it possible that the existing culture and environment contributes to the good performance of the school?
So the first one, they're measured 4 years after you, so it's at the end of, so yeah, I went through that very quickly. Those are sort of end of secondary school test scores measures, right? So it's 4 years, you've been in secondary school for 4 years. And we're going to see a very similar study in a second, where again, it's like going from primary school to secondary school, and I'm going to measure test scores at the end of secondary school. Culture, yeah, culture could matter. Yeah, I mean, these things they're hard to measure. School climate, hard to measure. It matters in some level, but really hard to measure. Okay, so let's go back to this study. And we didn't find any test score benefits, right, of going to a better school. So let's look at a similar study in Romania. Basically, it's the same setup. You have test, primary school student, roughly speaking, primary school students, they take an exit exam, and then they sort of, based on that, they can sort of go to sort of different tiers, different quality school tiers. Okay. So this again, Romania, this is Popelicis and Archeola. Okay, so again, this is basically a very similar setup. Okay, how far are you from the setup? Okay, so basically, you know, if you are far from the cutoff, you're not really going to this better school, and if you cross the threshold, you're more likely to go to the school. Okay, so again, significant first stage. This is again just showing you again very similar graph. What happens, you know, to the peer quality when you cross the threshold here? Okay, so there's a jump in peer quality. Okay, so basically, you know, on this side of the discount of the cutoff, you have, you know, peers with lower test scores. They're going to be peers with higher test scores on this side. Then it's a little noisier, but again here, you know, there's no selection to test taking at the end of school. Okay, so again, much like what we had, there's no differential attrition or anything like that into the sample that would complicate our lives. And what do they see here? This is now looking at the baccalaureate grade. So this is the end of secondary school exam that students take. It's a high stakes exam. And you're seeing a little bit of a jump. Okay, so kids who are on the right here, sorry, on the left here are doing a little bit worse. Kids on the left are doing a little bit worse. Kids on the right are doing a little bit better. Right, so there's a little bit of a jump there. And what we're seeing is, depending on specification, you're seeing basically 2% to 10% of a standard deviation. Okay, in test scores. Okay, so in this case, what we're finding is that in Romania, going to a better school does improve your test score outcomes. Okay. Now, what do? Well, they conduct a survey to sort of capture some of these behavioral effects. Okay. So what's happening? Well, what's interesting is parents who just get into the fancy school, they cut back on helping kids with homework. So they're like, well, you know, your teachers are good, you don't need me to help you with homework, right? That's sort of one thing that they find. They also find that students who just make it into these fancy schools seem to, you know, report more negative social interactions. So they seem to be a little bit more, you know, disadvantaged socially, and sort of, you know, that's not necessarily a good thing either, right? So what they do also find is that there's a reduction in these over time, right? So, you know, basically these diminish over time. They also find, what I didn't mention here, is they also find that teachers are better across the discontinuity. Potentially teachers are able to sort of sort into these better schools. Better teachers are able to sort into these better schools. Right? And so basically the net effect is that you have your production fraction parameter plus this behavioral effect. We're getting a small increase in test scores, right? Even though we might say that, you know, these behavioral responses probably mute the actual true effect, right? So this is despite you know, parents cutting back and students feeling sort of isolated in these schools. So the important takeaway is that, again, not necessarily these two you know, particular effects of sort of cutting back, etc., but essentially, if you are running a study, developing a research study, you really want to be able to capture these behavioral effects. Okay, so you really want to think carefully about how you design your study so that you are able to capture potential behavioral effects, because these can be very important in helping you understand what happened, why is it that why did you find what you find, and also just help you enrich your study and in a way that I think will also help you make the study more useful for external validity purposes, right? So we can then say, oh, this kind of mechanism we've seen before. This is very different from what we've seen before, right? So really, I think this helps us understand, what happened and why it happened. And that's really important for you to understand. Okay. So again, if we go back to the Kenya example, maybe what's happening is that there were behavioral effects that basically completely offset any sort of potential positive test score effects. Okay. Again, we don't have the ability to do that, but that's again a possibility, right? So you get into this fancy school, you're like, well, I don't need to work as much anymore because I'm in a fancy school now. I've got it made. So that's possible. Okay. So I guess we don't have that much more time, but let me just talk a little bit about sort of how you measure and how you put. Okay. How do we do some actual regressions and things like that, right? So when we're talking about production functions, we just sort of talked, sort of at a high level, this production function. How do we actually estimate these things? We usually just linearize things. So again, that's putting a lot of assumptions that these are additively linear. Okay, but you essentially are going to measure something. You're going to essentially do something like this, where you're going to look at sort of achievement measured by a test score is some function of lagged achievement, and then whatever matrix of vector of family inputs that you have, right? So that's kind of what you're going to be doing. Okay, and you can sort of fancy this up, put in all sorts of other things in there, but that's essentially the very basic thing. Okay, this is very hard to estimate because of omitted variables, not having all cumulative inputs. Having this helps a lot because we can sort of assume that it subsumes a lot of those other inputs, or sort of serves as a sufficient statistic for those. But it is very difficult to actually get sort of good measures of that. So just to sort of come back to our discussion of school quality, well, I think some of the things that we want to sort of, point out is just looking at, you need to look at test scores. So you shouldn't look at inputs as measures. You should look at test scores. Test scores themselves, average test scores, are not a great measure of quality because they are likely going to just reflect socioeconomic status or ability. So basically sorting. The best way to sort of approach this and measure this is through value added. Okay, so intuitively what it is thinking about, if you have two schools, the better school is the one, two schools with the same sort of inputs, the better school is the one that's going to produce better outcomes, right? Because they have the same level of inputs, the one that produces better outputs, grade A is going to be the better school, right? So basically, conditional inputs, how do you, what do you do with your inputs, right? That's essentially how productive are you, right? So you want to think of that as that's really what we care about, is sort of the productivity aspect. Okay, but VA, value added, is very hard to observe and it's not easy to measure, right? So, and the other thing is that you might not have the data to actually compute VA or to sort of actually get a sense of it. You need multiple cohorts of students. You need sort of previous and current test scores. You want to sort of have multiple cohorts, because again, sometimes what you end up happening is like, let's say, in one cohort they had really low test scores coming in just because, let's say, the kid was sick on that day, right? And so when you compute VA this year, value added this year, you're going to get huge value added, right? Because basically the kids' test scores were lower than what they should have been, right? So you're going to have these shocks that could happen that can throw off value added estimates for one cohort, right? And so by having sort of several cohorts, you're going to get a more reliable estimate of the school, of value added, either the school level, teacher level, etc. So that's just something to keep in mind, is that these things can get thrown off by shocks very easily. Just real quick, this is an aside, value add modeling. Again, if you want sort of to get more details, you can look at there's Cordell and others. 2015 is also Raj Chetty and others have done lots of work on this. So you can look at that for more details. Basically, you'll hear this term. What is it that people are actually computing? They're essentially computing the difference between, when you hear like value-added measures, they're essentially computing the difference between predicted and actual scores, right? So if you're doing school value-added estimates, you would basically take all the data you have, predict a student's test score, and then basically compute the average difference between the actual and the predicted test score of students. Okay, and there's again fancier ways to do this, etc. But that's essentially the idea. Is that how much better are you than what I predict based on all the data that I have, including sort of previous test scores. Okay, and you can do this at the teacher level. How much better are your students based on what I would have predicted. And so if your students are doing a lot better than predicted, that means you're a high value added teacher. If your students are doing a lot better at the school level than predicted, that means you're a high value added school. Okay, that's the intuition. Okay, again, there's a lot more. You can get a lot more complicated, do a lot more sort of fancier things, but essentially that's essentially what's going on. Okay. Again, look at this reference for more details. Okay, so let me just do two things real quick. I'm going to do this pretty quickly because I'm running out of time. Let me show, again, just going back to the sort of our discussion of behavioral effects and inputs. Okay. Let me show you something here about just the impact of school resources. Okay, so here we have this large RCT where we have four arms. One arm where we give schools extra resources, one arm where we give them incentives, and one arm where we give them both incentives and grants, and then one just controls. Okay, you will cover this paper next week, I believe. I'm just going to focus on this capitation grant, extra resource intervention. Okay, and the question I'm basically going to ask is, if I give schools extra resources, are test scores going to improve? Okay, that's essentially what I'm going to ask here. Okay, so just background real quick. Schools were supposed to get money from the government. They were supposed to get 10,000 Tanzanian shillings per student per year. And the idea was that they could use this to spend to improve, instruction. They couldn't pay teachers or build new buildings, but basically you have a lot of flexibility in how you use this. And the funds would be transferred from the government to schools, but then it's because of the way it was set up, there was a lot of leakage along the way. And there was, the disbursement schedule also was not predictable. Right? So schools just didn't know when they would get the funding. Okay. So what we did is basically we gave the schools 10,000 shillings per pupil per year for 2 years. Okay. So we gave them that. And this is on top of whatever they got from the government. And then we also told the government, please just don't change in response to us, right? Because again, you might say, oh, the government doesn't now says, oh, those guys are getting funding from schools from the study. Let's not give them money. The government continued to give them money. Okay. So this is basically a large increase in the resources. It's 3 times what they were getting before. Okay, so it's really big. Okay, does this funding increase resources at the school level, spending at the school level? Well, or again, so we want to look at all sources of spending. So you can see sort of in the first year we're getting 8,000 is being again out of 10,000, so 80% of the grant is being spent. Okay, you're seeing a little bit of a cutback from other sources, which is not surprising. So they were getting slightly less funding, but it's not completely offsetting it. So we're still getting a pretty big increase in total school expenditure, sort of resources. Okay, the household cuts back a little bit, and so at the end of the day, how much is sticking to the student? A pretty big chunk of money. Okay, is sticking to the student. In the second year, what you notice is 2 things. One, the schools don't spend as much from our grant, in part because they know it's ending, and so they start doing some saving because they're like, oh, I don't know, let me save to be financially prudent. They still get less from other sources. So we still have money coming, but then what happens here is that the households now are like, oh, not spending as much as they were before. Okay, so what's going on is in year one, again, this is sort of a surprise. They spend, they bought the books at the beginning of the year, they spend the school uniform, they did all the spending at the beginning of the year, so they basically have no time to respond, right? So this is unanticipated increase in resources from the household's perspective. They don't respond. In the second year, they anticipate, and so they cut back on spending, okay? And so the point is that, again, this is a behavioral response, right? So we increase funding, households cut back, okay? And so that can completely, mute your experiment or your intervention, right? If you're not careful. And so part of it is, again, a design thing here that we had to be very careful to measure this very, very carefully in order to pick this up, right? And understand exactly what was going on. So this took a lot of effort to actually measure all of this expenditure data. It took a lot of effort, okay? Do grants increase test scores? No. Okay, so in the first year where you have a lot of money floating around, nothing happens. The second year, nothing happens. Okay, so essentially we're seeing that just increasing grants, resources at the school level by a lot doesn't do much. Okay? Why not? Well, again, behavioral effects kick in, but again, they're not going to completely offset what we're finding. We have some evidence of precautionary savings. Again, they're sort of saving for a rainy day. This was actually interestingly also found in this context of Sabaral and others, where basically they gave textbooks to schools in Sierra Leone, and the schools saved them because they were like, oh, let's not waste these, let's not get, we don't know when we'll get textbooks next. Let's actually just lock them up and store them for a while rather than let the students use them, right? So that this is again, because just there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of resource allocation to these schools, and so it's not unsurprising that they behave in this way. Okay, and then I'll say this is that just giving grants does not change the process of learning, right? So we're not changing the productivity, we're just sort of giving resources, but we're not fundamentally changing how we teach or anything like that, right? So there's that could be another constraint that's happening, right? There might be other constraints, and so what you see that from our study is that if you give schools both grants and incentives, you actually see better learning outcomes, right? And so the point is that grants or resources are effective when teachers are motivated, and right. So when you have motivated teachers and they have the resources to use to support them, you can actually improve learning outcomes, right? So it's not saying that money is not effective. Money can be effective, but you also have to have the incentives and the structures around it such that the money will be used effectively, that there's an incentive to actually use this money effectively, and to sort of change the way that you do things, okay? So we argue again that, what this is showing is that resources and incentives are actually complements in the production function, right? And so again, if you want to improve learning and productivity, you want to actually take advantage of these complementarities, okay? And that you basically want to alleviate multiple constraints. Okay. So I'm out of time. I'll just mention one thing, which is, as we talked about with teachers, one of the things with teachers, and one thing that's very hard is sort of improving their content knowledge. What I will mention real quick is that that is hard to change, but there's evidence that teacher guides can have a big impact here, like scripting and sort of giving them sort of a lot of guidance. That's one approach you can use to address this. I'll say on class size, there's mixed evidence on this, but again, I think fundamentally it's a question of can you change what's happening in schools? And then finally, this again, it's a little bit self-promotion a little bit, but I'll mention one thing about information, which is information can improve, information on school quality can change things, right? And here's sort of an information, basically the government of Tanzania basically put out rankings, and essentially this put pressure on the worst performing schools. And what you see is, as a consequence of this, the worst performing schools actually improved their performance, okay? Again, there's no monetary reward, no nothing. It's just basically information provision. There might be a little bit of career incentives. So basically, because there was, again, there was a lot of pressure to improve learning outcomes this time, there might be some career incentives that you're basically activating here. But we are seeing sort of, publication of resources, of information is actually leading to increases in learning. But part of what's going on is that you're kicking out kids. Okay, so and so again, this is again where you want to be thoughtful and careful about, like, what are all the dimensions through which things might change? What are the mechanisms that are going on? And so again, we were very careful here to think about the potential for this, right? Like, can students be kicked out as a result and locked out of the system? And in this case, it's not just being locked out of the exam, it's actually being kicked out of school, right? So they're basically being pushed out of the school to sort of improve the test scores at the school level. So that's something I think that's also pretty, I think, depressing. So let me just wrap up, and then I'll stay on for a little bit to answer questions. I think what we've learned today is that education, the framework of the education production function, I think it's a very key framework that that's a workhorse. It helps us specify the relationship between inputs in the technology and learning outcomes. I think hopefully what I've argued is that, test score levels are not great measures, like average test scores are not great measures of school quality, like the average test score at the school. What you want is a value-added measure. Again, that's going to basically capture that productivity aspect better. The sort of framework that we discussed, I think, also helps us understand what we are estimating when we look at sort of different research designs. And I think that's important because often what we're estimating is not production function parameters, but sort of policy parameters, which include behavioral effects. And the key takeaway is, again, you want to design your study to capture these behavioral effects and understand these behavioral effects, right? Because they're going to really be important in essentially driving your results. Okay, so you really want to spend time thinking through, how do you measure this? Where, who might respond? Is it the parent, or the student, the teacher? And you really want to be able to capture that. And it's very hard to do. It's really hard to do, but again, the best studies are going to be able to do that. So let me pause there. I have gone a few minutes over, but I'm happy to take some questions now.
Okay, I'll read out some questions from the past few minutes. There was one question, sorry, I've lost it. Is it possible to look to what extent families can respond to input change? Another one was, if we want to measure value added to assess its impacts on test scores, would computing the value of school requirements be a good idea? For example, many schools show a list of requirements from the parents.
Okay. I think, can you repeat that last one?
Sure. If we want to measure value added to assess its impacts on test scores, would computing the value of school requirements be a good idea? For example, I think they're talking about the school's requirements from parents in regards to enrolling the students.
No, I don't think I mean, so the main thing you would want is sort of like test scores, right? Because that's so requirements are not, you can think of that, again, if you're in the same school, right, the requirements are going to basically fall out, right? Because it's the same requirements over, period 1, period 2, so they're going to fall out essentially. So what you care about is basically what is the predicted score of the student, at a given point in time based on all the data that you have historically on that student versus what their actual learning level is, right? And then you sort of average that at the school level, the teacher level, the classroom level. Okay, so that's the key thing, right? So you don't need things like school requirements.
We have another question about the teacher incentives, asking, were they based on individual merit?
Yeah, this was based on basically, teachers were given a bonus based on how well each student did. Okay, so you'll see more of that next week. So I was just basically, but you'll see a lot. My co-author, who's teaching next week, will discuss this paper in more depth.
I think maybe we have time for one more. This is a question from earlier in the lecture, but interrupt me if you already answered it. What are the good survey instruments available for measuring creativity, cognitive ability, beyond reading mathematics, for which several instruments are already available?
Creativity is really hard to measure. So again, you would want to look at the psychology literature there a little bit, but there are a number of different ways to measure it. One is sort of Torrance task. Basically, you ask someone, for example, like how, this is a common item. Tell me sort of some unusual ways you might use this, right? So here's a spoon, here's a glass. How to use this? Tell me everything. And so the idea is that the more sort of things they can think of that are sort of not outside of the box, that sort of measures creativity. And then you can also give them these sort of puzzles where they basically like fill in the line and things like that. So there are different ways to get at this. It's not easy at all. And you want to make sure that it's culturally adapted to the setting. Okay, so one of I tried measuring this in the past using sort of spoons. It was really hard, asking kids like, how do you, here's a spoon, what can you do with it? And essentially the kids just like, oh, this is a spoon, I eat with it. And so they would just keep saying, I eat rice with it. Okay, what else? Oh, I eat corn with it. I eat beans with it. And then they just kept giving you lists of food that they ate with it, right? So it's like, so you have to be very careful about how you adapt these things, and sort of. But yeah, there's a number of different ways you can measure it. Okay. Anything else that is burning?
I think we may be out of time. Feel free to read the Q&A yourself if you'd like to answer anything in particular, but I think we may be out of time now.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Sorry I had to rush a little bit at the end, but I hope this was helpful. And yes, please let me know if you have further questions, and we'll try and get back to you.